But today we're going to talk about something quite different. Being in Spain, I wanted to get to know Spain, of course. Interestingly, my mother's side of the family is from Colombia. I told you about my father's side of the family. My mother's side of the family is from Colombia, and apparently almost all that ancestry comes from Spain. So between Spain and Norway, Denmark, that's most of my ancestry right there. But we live in Spain, and of course I wanted to read Don Quixote, the great novel, one of the most famous novels in the world, and oftentimes considered to be the best-known literature and novel, certainly, of the country of Spain, and maybe the entire Spanish language, which after English is the second most spoken language in the world, by some counts. And I was surprised when I found in this novel the story of a convert from Islam to Christianity. I didn't expect to find this. And so today what I want to do is explore a little bit of that, not in terms so much of literary analysis, but in terms of looking at the historical context of what it was like living there in Spain in the late 1500s, the early 1600s, which is when the author is around, at a time when conversion to Islam was a lot more common than conversion from Islam. And we're going to take a look at that. And I'm going to propose to you that Cervantes, even though it's set in this kind of lighthearted, usually fun and satirical story of this exotic, harmless, rather humorous, rather ridiculous figure of Don Quixote, who is minor nobility and goes around and he does ridiculous, silly things, right? Every now and then, Cervantes, as an author, will insert a story of action or romance or drama or suspense into those stories. Don Quixote was originally produced as in series. Every chapter would be published, and then the people in the neighborhood would save up money, and when the book vendor came around selling the latest chapter, they would all pitch in, and they would get the newest chapter of Don Quixote, and then they would find one of the guys in the neighborhood who knew how to read. It was not a common skill, but some people did know. And they would get together and sit down and listen to this man read the latest chapter of Don Quixote. So what is the religious context like at this time in the late 1500s and the early 1600s? Well, there are two dates that every person, every Spaniard knows by heart. The first one is very easy to remember. You have it memorialized all around your city. You can buy bus tickets there. What am I talking about? 7-Eleven. That is the entrance of Islam into Iberia. And then the other number, you probably already know it too, but you probably already know it because that's the discovery of the New World, 1492. So in terms of Spanish history, these are two dates that you really want to memorize, like 622, the beginning of the Islamic calendar, 325, 1517, 1519, you can date the Reformation to different places. So these are two big dates. So 7-Eleven is the entrance of Islamic imperialism into Iberia. And 1492 is the end of Islamic political power in Iberia, but it is by no means the end of an Islamic presence in Iberia. That is when the last guy from Granada heads out of Spain. He could have converted to Catholicism, and actually for rulers to convert from one religion to another to maintain their position was not entirely unknown. Indeed, conversion from Islam to Christianity to Judaism and any of those things, I'm not going to say it was common, but none of these things were radically new, novel, or unseen in that period of time. So what else do we know about this period? Well, first of all, there was a big problem, of course. You know, Islam, if I may quote the Ayatollah Khomeini later on, revolutionary, different part of the world, Islam is politics or it's not Islam, right? And that is definitely how Islam was seen by Muslims in Iberia. Islam has to be a political system. Yes, it has religious elements, spiritual, transcendental claims, rituals and rites, buildings, scriptures, but it is and must be a political system. So the Catholic majesties had a difficult problem on their hand, a difficult issue. They could have just forced them all out. That would have actually been the easiest thing to do, to force all the Muslims to leave. They could have forced all the Muslims to convert, but that would have run against the idea that you cannot force conversion. You can persuade conversion, you can offer incentives to conversion to Christianity, but really just straight up forcing conversion was, even at that time, seen as something that was beyond the pale and inconsistent with the heart of the Catholic Church. So what did they do? They offered people the choice, and they did this for the Jews as well as the Christians. And we have good reasons to believe that not Cervantes himself, but his ancestors, probably one or two generations in the past, had been Jews who converted to Christianity. Now, today you can go to Alcalá de Henares outside of Madrid, and you can actually go to the parish church where Cervantes was baptized. And every year we have the Cervantino Festival, which is a lot of fun. Come hang out in Madrid. You can stay with me and my family, and we'll take you. We have no reason to think that Cervantes himself did not have a sincere Catholic faith. We have a lot of stuff from his biography to show that he did. Now, on the other hand, I want to propose that the story of the convert of Zoraida, who is, I'll briefly summarize her story here in a few minutes, is a corrective. It is a critique. That still there is the living memory at this time, and we actually see it in Don Quixote. We see one story, it's a different story, of a guy named Ricote. Ricote is a Muslim who didn't want to convert, so he left, and as did a lot of Muslims who didn't want to convert. But then he had to go back and find a family treasure, so he disguises himself as a German pilgrim to go back to Spain. It's funny, right? But on the other hand, it's telling us something serious about the context. Also, the very preface or the prologue of Don Quixote has the author just giving us this sort of narrative of like, well, I was walking through the markets, I think it's Toledo, and I found these Arabic scripts. So I had to go find one of the Moriscos. These are ex-Muslims who became Christians, and I had to have him translate it. And it was such an interesting story, and I had him translate the whole thing. And here's the story of Don Quixote. Like, that's kind of the setup for the whole narrative. So all this element of Islam and Christianity and having just a dynamic texture of different religions, it's all in there. It is throughout the entire book. So this is not just one story, it is throughout the entire book. But I want to suggest that Zoraida's story of conversion is a corrective. That Cervantes has heard stories, and he has known stories of people who converted, that they became Christians, and that there, in some way there was something deficient and wrong with how the church did that, and also with how they were then treated. For example, one of the most draconian and we would say unethical, a clear violation of religious freedom and respect for human dignity, is that the new Christians, and that's what they were called the new Christians versus the old Christians. The old Christians had stayed Christian during the entire period of Islamic imperialism. We could talk about Islamic imperialism and how decade after decade, century after century, the percentage of Muslims in Iberia goes 10, 20, 30, 40. Okay? We can talk about that. It's actually, there's a good quote from Fletcher in the paper, so read that. So, he has an awareness. He has a memory. He's living, Cervantes is living this out in his own life, this nuanced texture of different faiths. And he is, with this story of Zoraida, I want to suggest, trying to offer a corrective. Let me go back to the new Christians and the old Christians. The old Christians had superior rights. They actually had laws called the purity of blood laws, so that the old Christians could not get married to the new Christians. Many of the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries that would go off to the Americas, they were from the new Christians. They were converts, second, third, fourth generation, from Muslim and Jewish families. Why would they go off to America? Well, I'm sure that some of them had missionary zeal to spread the true faith, but the reality is that the main positions in Spain, many of them were not available to them because they were new Christians. Even after 3 or 4 generations, they were still new Christians. Also, the new Christians, that's the descendants of the converts from Judaism and Islam, could not intermarry. I mean, there are always exceptions, but by and large, they could not intermarry with the old Christians. So there were two different levels of Christians. And we're going to find that Cervantes in the story of Zoraida is going to say, no, get rid of all that. So you have that, you have the new Christians, you have the old Christians, you have the memory of people converting. Maybe they have some sort of faith, but they have not been correctly catechized. Many of the family names to this day in Spain, if they have like the name of a saint as the family name, that's just because they took the name of the saint of that day when they were baptized. So San Pedro, St. Peter, well, apparently this family of Jews or Muslims was baptized on the feast day of St. Peter, end of June. And that's all there is to it. So we're going to name them St. Peter. So he's aware that there's been a lack of catechism, a lack of formation. There is sometimes a lack of sincerity. Some people do convert, and they are kind of holding their fingers like this. I don't know if this is an American thing. It means that I'm going to lie, but it's okay because I'm crossing my fingers. And so that's also going on at the same time. One of the reactions to that, of course, is the Inquisition. I'm not going to go too much into the Inquisition, but I will say this. The Inquisition lasts for many centuries in Spain, not in spite of the desire of the Spanish people. The Inquisition continued to exist century after century because the Spanish people, by and large, with exceptions, felt that it was important for them to have a group of people that would ensure the purity of the faith in Spain. They also were very efficient in getting rid of Protestants. So, let's get to the story of Zoraida. We've talked a little bit about the very interesting context that we find in Spain at this time. Zoraida is in the first volume of Don Quixote. There are two volumes, or really it's two books. We usually can buy them as one book, but there are two books. Cervantes found success. He wrote the first book, and then someone, we don't actually know who he was, it's a matter of historical debate, published a second volume. And so that kind of goaded Cervantes on to writing the second volume of the book Don Quixote. And this is in the first volume, and this is part of what's normally called the Tale of the Captive. The Tale of the Captive. You can go to Spotify or YouTube, type in Don Quixote, Tale of the Captive, and listen to the whole thing. It's about 3 chapters long. The Tale of the Captive is normally divided into 3 sections. We are looking at the 3rd section. The Tale of the Captive is told to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza and their companions at an inn. It's a rundown inn. Don Quixote, of course, thinks it's a fabulous castle. But Ruy, which is the name of the captive, is accompanying a young lady who is dressed in Arab garb. And they go into the inn and they say, well, who are you? And Ruy says, I have a very long story. And they say, we have time. So he tells it's called the Tale of the Captive. So if you want to find it online or whatever, just find Tale of the Captive. And this is the 3rd section. In brief, Ruy doesn't know if any of his family is alive. He decided to go into the military. He ends up being captured. After a whole bunch of things happen, he ends up in North Africa in what's called a baño. A baño is basically not really slave quarters. It's kind of like a detention center. And it's a place where they would put the prisoners of war who appeared to be from wealthy families, waiting for them to get ransomed. Okay, so he's not a slave. He has relative freedom within that place, but he can't just leave and do whatever he wants. Ruy is there with some other people. The people who have captured him figure that he's worth something because he's a captain, so he must be from a family that has something. But Ruy really has no hope that he's going to be ransomed. So Ruy, one day they see that a stick has been kind of extended, a cane, with a string from a window of a neighboring building. Oh, what happens? Well, anyway, one of the guys goes up to get the little scroll there, and it shakes and says no. Anyway, Ruy is the guy who's chosen, so he finally goes and gets it, and we meet Zoraida. Zoraida is the beautiful daughter. So, of course, you're going to be surprised. She's the most beautiful woman in the whole city, right? Obviously. And Zoraida had a Christian maid, and the Christian maid had taught her to pray to Mary, very Catholic, to pray to Mary. And then after she died, the Christian maid appeared to Zoraida in different dreams. And Zoraida wants to become a Christian, and she has chosen Rui. And she communicates to Rui, if you will get me out of here, get me to Spain, agree to marry me, then we'll get to Spain, I will be a Christian, we will get married, everything will be fine. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. It ends up happening like that. Now, there are a couple of difficulties that I'm not really going to get into too much. At the end, there is a happy ending. Let me identify a couple of the main elements that I think that Cervantes is telling us, hey, this is the right way that a conversion is supposed to happen. These are on page 6. Well, the first thing is, then as now, it would have been entirely reasonable to be very suspicious of someone's testimony, basically. Of course, that's not the word that they use in Don Quixote. But like basically her sharing why she wants to be a Christian. It would have been very natural for people to say, no, that doesn't happen. Cervantes says, no, listen to the testimony. Listen to the testimony. Another thing that we find is that conversion is active, not passive. Right? The conversion of all these people, like, well, I guess we want to stay in Spain. I guess we'll be Catholic. That's not very active. Whereas Zoraida, who's a young woman, she has these amazing ideas. And of course, she's aided by a number of Christian men who go out of the way, put their lives in danger to rescue her and to take her to Spain. She has an amazing amount of agency. She is an active player in her conversion. She's just not there being passive. And I think Cervantes is saying conversion should be active. Third, the Christian community must secure the physical well-being of the convert. The Christian community must secure the physical well-being of the convert. These guys who are rescued, they go on this, she gives them money, they ransom themselves, they buy a boat. It's a long plan. But then finally they're able to do it, and they don't go back on their word. They end up losing a lot of stuff, including their boat and stuff like that, if you read the story. But they do it. Because, why? Because her faith is pure. So the Christian community, and this I think is what Cervantes is saying, the Christian community has the obligation to secure the well-being of the convert. The Christian community must assure the political security of the convert as well. And the book doesn't say this. Back then, when you published a novel in Spanish, you had to get the local bishop to give it its imprimatur, the stamp. So he had to be kind of veiled in his critiques of the church. And the church didn't mind that, as long as you were not too straightforward in your critique of the church. They were able to deal with that. That you have to secure their rights. And you really see that in their agreement to get married. Rui apparently does come from a family of the old Christians. And here is Cervantes saying, why not? Why not? They can get married. They love each other. They both have sincere faith. Let them get married. Don't worry about these questions of purity of blood, which is what all the Spaniards who were sitting around in their neighborhood listening, they were, well, Rui sounds like he's probably from the old Christian families, And Cervantes, he doesn't raise the question. He can't, But he doesn't raise the question of course they're going to get married. The Christian community provides a new family for the convert. You see this at the happy ending, at the inn, where, again, you have to kind of listen to this or read the whole story. Rui is reunited with his brother. His brother is going off to the Indies to be a judge, and he learns that his family is still alive. On the other hand, we also learn that catechism for baptism is not to be rushed. Well, there's the priest there. If you know anything about Don Quixote has two main friends, the barber and the priest, Father Nicholas. Father Nicholas is there at the story, but he never says, well, hey, she has faith, let's baptize her. And it actually says, according to the ceremonies of our church. That means she needs to learn the Mass, she needs to learn about baptism. And if you learn the liturgy of the Mass, the liturgy of baptism, you're going to basically learn the creeds, you're going to learn the foundations of the Christian faith. And no one says, well, let's go ahead and do this now. We're going to go ahead and do this, everything at its right time. And perhaps most controversially today, what do we think about converts marrying people from a Christian background. I've known pastors and ministers who say, I don't let that happen, I don't like that. Well, Cervantes, again, he's not a minister, he doesn't have any kind of theological background to this, but he is saying, yeah, why not? Why not? Her faith is sincere. She's actually sacrificed a great deal. She came from a wealthy family, which she has left. She alienated her father. She didn't intend to do it. There's actually a confrontation with the dad, and I'll end up with this. And the dad says, why would you do this to me? And the girl says, I had no desire to offend you, father, but you will have to ask Mary. So we'll end with that.